yeah, let me tell you the story about how we first started out working in Kong District, Champasak Province in southern Laos on a project that was initially called the Lao Community Fisheries and Dolphin Protection Project. It was started in January 1993, and we kind of took some ideas that we learned from community fisheries work that had been done in coastal Thailand, actually, where I'd been involved in some project and I'd seen some really good community work there. And I wanted to see if this sort of model could be replicated in the context of, the Mekong River in southern Laos. So we came into the situation with an understanding that these people that we were working with had, considerable knowledge about the resources that they were interacting with. These were, most of them were professional fishermen and had been fishing since they were able to walk, and had a lot of experience and knowledge. And so we had the idea that we wanted to promote better management of fisheries in the area, but we weren't quite sure what could be done, or what would be the best way to approach that. We did have confidence that these people knew a lot and had a strong knowledge basis to begin with, probably more so than we had. So the first thing we felt is that we need to learn from them, and we need to hear what they had to say. And we didn't put a strict timeline on having to do certain activities or, achieve certain types of, protection targets. It was a very small project with a small amount of money. We located ourselves in the village, rather than in the district of the provincial capital. So we were living in the village ourselves, and we were, and then we started to interact with all the people there about, fishing, and asking them, or, what could be done and how would it be best to approach that. And it took a number of months. And eventually I remember there was one old guy who came up and said to me, he was living in the village that I was staying in. And he said, in Lao, of course, none of these people spoke English. He said, well, if you really want to do something to protect the fish in the Mekong, you need to think about the deep water pools in the middle of the river. Because when the Mekong River has very high waters in the rainy season and very low waters in the dry season, because it's in a monsoonal climate. And therefore, during the rainy season, when there's a lot of water, there's nothing that you can, there's not much that can be done to protect fish. And in fact, fish are naturally protected themselves by there being so much water, and the water flowing so quickly that it's, difficult for people to catch them anyway. But the key moment is in the dry season, when the water is at its lowest, because at that point, all the fish, especially the larger brood stock, will go into the deep water pools and concentrate themselves there. And local people have known this for a very long time. And historically, they have sometimes targeted these areas for fishing during the dry season, because it's the best place to catch fish. But as fishing effort had increased over time and the quality of fishing gears had gotten, higher, some overfishing was occurring in those deep water pools. So they basically explained it to us. This was the issue. This was, basically so we said, okay, they agreed. They said, well, we should have a certain place. We should protect these particular deep water areas in the dry season, and we can fish all around them. That's okay. And so they set up a situation that would allow them to continue fishing in some areas, but some of the deep areas would be protected. When other villages in surrounding areas, heard that this was happening, it made sense to them, because it was all, it wasn't our idea in the first place. It was their idea to start with. So it fit with the ecological knowledge of the people that were living in that area, and neighboring villages had, similar, experiences and similar knowledge. And so it made sense to them, and they said, this is something we would like to do. How would we do it? And they started to actually come to us and say, would you come and work with us? Because we kind of know what we want to do, but the key thing that we were able to provide was a link to the government, so that the government would help them to recognize their system. So our role was sort of facilitating that. The knowledge was on the villagers' side, but they often needed some recognition from the government that they were mandated to do that. That would give them a lot more of a mandate, and they would feel more confident to try to enforce some of these rules or create a better management system for them. So so this was and so we expanded village by village, year by year. We went from working in just a few villages to eventually working in over 72 villages throughout the district. We're adding about 10 villages a year. And we didn't actually choose the villages. They would actually write letters to us. We sort of said, we talked about it with the district, and the district said, well, why don't we set it up in such a way that we'll let all the villages know in the district that they could potentially work with you, but we'll let them invite you to work with them. And if they send a letter and invite us, then we'll go and talk to them, and we'll help them to facilitate this process. That would be based on, and each village would have their own separate system of management, dependent on their circumstances and their knowledge. We would help them to get recognition from the government, but we would only go to the villages that would actually invite us. If some villages weren't ready for it, or they weren't inclined to want to do something for whatever reason, they weren't ready for it, we just wouldn't go. And we would go to the villages that invited us. And, obviously that made things a lot easier, because they had already made the decision before they even contacted us that they were wanting to work with us. And this, made a lot easier cooperation. And then we would basically lay out the process to them. And then we would say, okay, we're going to go away now. And we would go away, and we'd give them 1 month to work it out on their own. How could they set up a system that would be recognizable by the government, their own thing. But there were a few things that they had to be careful that they didn't do, such as setting up discriminatory rules against other villages that they were not willing to enforce themselves. And so this was, once we sort of told them the process, and then we said, we'll leave it to you, because you guys need to work this out on your own. You're the ones that are going to be, enforcing this and living with this over time. We were just helping to get the process. And then we'd come back in a month, and then we, facilitate they'd already have kind of a draft of what they wanted, but then we would facilitate further discussions, often separating men and women into separate groups, to try to get some different ideas on a gender basis, and then we're incorporating these together with what they'd already come up with. And basically we bring with them some government officials who were authorized to sort of approve these arrangements. So basically, it was kind of a co-management situation in which, but for the most part, it was the villagers that were coming up with the rules, enforcing them, but with a little bit of oversight from the government to make sure that conflict wasn't being caused with other villages in particular, because if that happened, that would be a problem. So they wanted to make sure that villages weren't excluding other villages in a way that would be using conservation measures as a way to kind of restrict access to other people that they were not willing to restrict on themselves. I mean, what we found when they set up these fish conservation zones was that if they could protect the zone, they'd actually see a lot of fish physically, like in the area. The fish would concentrate there, and they would come to the surface and stuff, and they would see them a lot. But then when they would fish just outside of the area, they found that their fishing improved, as they were kind of getting some of the fish that were because they weren't, all staying in the area constantly. They would sometimes go elsewhere, and so some of them were getting caught, and so people, actually, the government was a really important part of what we were doing, because at a certain point they didn't consider it to be conservation. They thought it was kind of like community development. This was a way to increase people's income, was to set up fish conservation zones, and they believed that that was improving people's income. But that's what people were reporting. The district government was the key. And at that time, unlike many other places in the world, they were not really benefiting economically from these fisheries. They weren't collecting taxes. And they had a fisheries office, but they were essentially not enforcing anything, or very little. Maybe if they heard about some, grenades being used or something, they might go out, but, basically they didn't have any budget. They didn't have much staff. They kind of knew that the villagers knew more than them anyway. Most of the staff were villagers themselves, but they just weren't, but they weren't as senior villagers, and they didn't know as much because they'd been going to school or something. And so, but that helped a lot. So that was one big thing, was a lot of the government officials coming from the villages. They respected the knowledge of the villages because it fit with their own understanding. So that's, but the other thing is I agree that if they had been making a lot of money off this, it would have been much more difficult. But because they weren't, it was kind of like, okay, what do we have to lose here? We give the power over to the villagers to manage this. We're not really managing it anyway. Essentially, it's already under their management, except they don't have a real mandate to do it. So we'll just give them the mandate, and that could only mean better management, and that can only benefit our people, and we're not losing any income because we were never really collecting anything anyway.
I've been interested in traditional ecological knowledge, mainly as it evolves around problems with management, maybe problems of how to balance commercial fisheries versus other consumptive uses, particularly recreational and subsistence uses. And particularly in Alaska, subsistence is supposed to be the priority consumptive use of resources. So when we studied subsistence patterns and areas where people harvest to understand how best to protect their consumptive uses. There are a number of interesting issues that arise, I think, in lots of fishery studies. But one of them is that there may, for example, be different terms for a salmon or a fish during different parts of its life cycle. And of course, we have that in Western science, but the terms are often more descriptive in indigenous terminology. The other thing that you have is you might have over differentiation. So you might have more species recognized in the indigenous taxonomy than you do in Western science. And so a very interesting one with salmon is that there are two terms that describe what are simply known as red salmon or sockeye salmon in Western science that are different basic terms. And one of them, saha, refers to a very skinny kind of salmon, which thrives in just a couple of different environments where being skinny and getting up falls is an adaptive trait. But genetically and materially they are significantly different from other sockeye, as I understand it. But I'm not sure that I haven't done the genetics of the investigation. And then they have over in an area by Sitka, the former Russian American capital, they have a one called the guk, which is a little sockeye in Western taxonomy, but a completely different term. Duck and gok, they're not related at all in language. So it's essentially recognized as a separate species, and one that's celebrated because it has a very distinct flavor and texture when it's dried and smoked. And so people celebrate that, and they even develop things like proverbs from those species, because they're associated with their, you might say, with their regional identity. But in the case of this little sockeye, this daguk, they developed a proverb about it because in oral history, it's said that the people once dammed the river, or put a fishing weir across the river, and blocked the path of this little daguk, and the salmon left the stream and never returned. And so from that, they learned, you might say, the concept of escapement through that negative experience. And they developed a proverb about it, "Klek daguk awatini yik," which means don't go away like those little sockeye. And they say that to people sometimes at a potlatch, a major ceremony, when they don't want them to leave before it's over. So lest they have insulted their guests. So I think little things like that in language are quite interesting, whether it's, you know, over differentiation or how an experience with, you might say, fisheries exploitation or management teaches a lesson that's, you know, that becomes emblematic in a proverb or a saying. But it's also important in the sense that a lot of people assume indigenous peoples, because they lacked, you know, sophisticated technology or anything like that, could not have overexploited their resources. But that little anecdote that I just conveyed is essentially it's telling us something very important. On the Northwest coast, this weir technology, this wooden stake arrangement in rivers, which was used to trap salmon, could literally take every salmon in the stream. And that technology's been around for at least 6,000 years. And so the fact that you don't have very many salmon streams that have lost species of salmon tells you that people, you know, not only didn't overexploit them, but could have and didn't, and developed rules and proverbs and techniques for maintaining their populations. And that's something that's certainly Western science has not been aware of, because it hasn't investigated and utilized TEK. Other management, I think, blind spot is with small streams, right? So there are great big transboundary 5-species salmon streams, you know, throughout the Northwest coast. Those get a lot of attention because they're of tremendous commercial value or recreational value. But there are also very small streams which maybe just have returns of a couple of thousand salmon, but they could be really instrumental for communities because they're proximal to their, you know, traditional dwelling places or contemporary dwelling places, and they may have historical or heritage ties to those streams. And so I think one of the things that indigenous knowledge has said is that these little streams are very important. You know, maybe they're one of the places where those little red salmon still go, and they're very much worth conserving. And interestingly, the science is catching up with that, and it's saying essentially, much like stocks, you know, investments, you want to keep a portfolio of not just, you know, big company stocks or just transboundary rivers that you're taking care of, but you need to look after these small streams as well, because in some cases they can be more resilient, or they can stand up against extreme events better than some of these larger systems which might crash. I've heard a lot of things from scientists which I think are really odd sorts of responses to why they can't include traditional ecological knowledge. And one of them is that, and I've heard scientists say this, we can only utilize data that we ourselves gather. And I think that's really a preposterous notion, because you know, good scientists gather information from other scientists, other sources all the time, and they may seek to verify that or replicate it if it's an experiment, but to just ignore data that you yourself are not collecting, especially in your limited time scale and your limited budgets and so forth, is not a good approach to science. And one of the things that traditional knowledge does is it gives us a much longer, potentially time scale and spatial, fine-grained spatial scale with which to complement scientific investigations. So that's not a good excuse, and can be a real real barrier. I think another real hindrance is trust, and there's a lot of talk in North America today about co-production of environmental knowledge and fisheries knowledge, which can build trust. But of course, you have to have trust before you can get co-production going. But co-production simply means you're working with local communities in through all phases of the scientific process, from conceptualization to research design to funding and hiring, to data collection, to data interpretation, dissemination, and then actual decision making that comes from the science. And I think co-production is a very promising approach. It's already in practice in some of the major watersheds that we have in Alaska, for example, but elsewhere in North America, Canada, and I know it's also being utilized in places like Australia. But certainly more could be done to develop a model and best practices around co-production, so that it is equitable, that trust is developed, and that you get the best science that's then translated into the best management for all the key stakeholders, but particularly the local and indigenous people who are dependent on those resources. So I think that's a very promising approach to fisheries management, especially given all the issues with climatic change that are likely to affect streams. Keeping a close eye on those and getting local users to help with scientific investigation and interpretations will really enhance our understanding of climate change on aquatic and marine habitats, and hopefully allow us to respond better. So.
The whole sort of process of participatory approaches to developing natural resource management plans is a good management plan is one that people buy into, and therefore have had time to work through, share their understanding, reach a kind of common consensus about how to, or the measures that need to be taken, and all of these other aspects that form a management plan, which are basically limiting effort, avoiding destructive techniques, preserving sufficient broodstock for the next season, not hammering on the stock when it's in its most vulnerable state, either as juveniles or as spawning animals, and then when you capture them, ensuring that there's a reasonably equitable access to those resources and it's not monopolized by a few individuals. That's the perfect planning, captures all of those elements. And as we've been chatting just now, that a lot of those aspects of where the fish are, when you do and do not fish them, how you ensure an equitable access to the resource, and somehow how you limit your overall effort on that stock. All of those are critical elements. The issue that we have inexorably is that the numbers of people that fish increase year by year, and have done since time began. And we've really hit the limits, and really some time ago hit the kind of the carrying capacity for the numbers of fishers and the amount of effort that we could place on most of these fisheries. So now fishing effort and fishing activity really is a major part of the jigsaw. There will be agreements and norms and traditions around not hammering on the resource when it's fragile. And that's, again, because of conflict generally, because if one person goes in and starts catching all of the broodstock because they're concentrated at a particular time of year, they are removing benefit for the greater community at a later period. And that gets picked up pretty quickly. And of course, there would be pushback on that. It's very different when everyone's fishing and everyone needs that fish because you're in a situation where the resource has declined because you are now overfishing it, or because the environment no longer sustains as many fish as before. That becomes very challenging for a community just to agree to stop. These fishing days on those recession ponds that I was telling you about are an example where they say, right, but it's, again, the idea is that you actually don't leave anything behind. They pretty much fish it out, but at least everyone has a go at it. that's really the big challenge that faces all kind of communities and natural resource users now, that our capacity to take is now exceeded the capacity of the system to sustain us with fish. So I guess that's really the greatest challenge, because we don't really have traditional knowledge tools in the toolbox. There's some, and again, if you incorporate traditional knowledge and communities' knowledge into the plans, and there is ownership within the plan, at least you're building a base for dialogue within the community to reach an inevitable conclusion that effort needs to be decreased. Sometimes you'll come up with a solution, alternate fishing days. The commonest one that I guess I've heard, mainly for marine fisheries, that kind of becomes acceptable is like no fishing on a holiday. So you'll find actually anyway there are traditions not to fish on full moon days because they're Buddhist holidays, for example. But it's also the time when the fish are actually at their maximum. So this is a bit tricky. You'll find Sundays in the Philippines related to the Catholic religion will be a no fishing day. But that's only 1 day in 7. In some cases, you really need to take that down to like 1 in 2. Obviously, the inevitable thing is that as fishing becomes less and less productive, you can't afford to spend so much time chasing so few fish. Then you will have people diversifying or leaving the fishery to do something else. So this is also an inevitable tendency or trend. But it's not really a traditional knowledge thing there. This really underpins having alternatives, avenues, or using other knowledge to say, well, okay, what, you know, if I can't fish, what else am I going to do here? That's the way out. How do you escape from fishing when fishing is no longer viable? You know, every single management plan or community management plan that was ever developed almost always drew down to some extent on the local fishery officers. And this is really interesting because it was never really formally recognized that the state was already essentially co-managing. It didn't have control over these resources at that level. It couldn't. It was, you know, one person, one government officer has enormous areas to cover. They can't possibly regulate and manage everything. It is largely managed by the resource users themselves. But what was critical was that there was interaction, and that this knowledge and local knowledge was often in the hands of that local officer. And certainly they would be using that to inform the processes that they did when they fed back rules. You know, they would sort of say, oh, we've got this new rule coming. I said, yeah, but it's not going to work here because of this and that. Now, this caused a lot of problems for them because the rule would come down from the top, but they knew from the bottom up that this thing was never going to fly. It was going to be impossible to enforce, and their job to enforce it was going to be basically untenable. So what you had was accommodation. You had a sort of interpretation, or even turning a blind eye to foolish laws. At the local level. This essentially was co-management, if in all but words. We started to explore this, and very quickly, government fisheries department started to acknowledge that this is actually the de facto situation, and it made a lot of sense actually to have rather flexible, you know, legislation or regulation on a number of non-negotiables. Like, you will not use poisons, you will not use dynamite, things that were kind of obvious, but that there would be a lot of flexibility around, you know, mesh sizes or where people could or could not fish. These sort of things were sort of much more locally determined. Hence, a sort of a recognition that knowledge that is within the local community could be drawn on, that knowledge was accessible to some degree with government officers, particularly if they were quite engaged with communities in their day-to-day fishery management. And this is why these participatory management plans involving local government officers and communities are so powerful, because it's where the state top-down system engages with the community bottom-up system, and you emerge with a the compromise or the working solution. And of course, ideally, once you've elaborated that, having that recognized within your local authority, within the decentralized powers or the delegated powers available, to then give that community plan legitimacy, so that if someone breaks those rules or contravenes those rules, they can be sanctioned in some way, then this makes for an extremely powerful arrangement. And is extremely empowering for communities, because those rules make sense to them. You get much higher likelihood of compliance. They make sense to the state, because the state can't control that resource anyway. And what you are achieving is far more productive and effective than imposing one-size-fits-all rules down on a system, which are never going to work. So it is a win-win for both the state and the communities. Obviously, a locally born fishery officer whose family probably fished is going to be much more receptive to this and much more in tune with this than someone who's been, let's say, moved from a completely different area that perhaps has no history or tradition of knowledge of what's been going on. It really does often boil down to charismatic characters in communities or within local government to really make that happen. One of the big challenges we have in fisheries is that it's seen as being a dirty, smelly occupation. And almost nobody wants to graduate in fisheries now. They all want to graduate in aquaculture, which is, they see that's where the money is and the career is. And they think that fisheries is a dead end. And so they're having trouble getting people to apply for fisheries degrees and to apply for those positions. And so there's actually now a kind of real decline in capacity within government in capture fisheries. It's extremely unfashionable. I think it's just, poorly factored in. Is that, I mean, what countries should be doing is actually screening for people that want to work in these kind of environments, and as you say, have the general disposition that makes them good community level workers or people that work well at these kind of levels and enjoy that kind of thing.